Hello, everyone. I thought I would review the first set of Kant review questions. This is from the first week of the deeper dive into Kant and the part that really is about the first version of the categorical imperative. Number one, explain why the concept of the goodwill is so important for Kant's moral philosophy. Well, of course, there's no one way to approach that. But I think that part of the context here is that for Kant, the moral worth of an action, that is, if we're looking at an action itself and we're deciding whether it is morally good or not, everything depends upon the intention with which it's done. That is one of the things that I have repeatedly done in class or in notes is to do something like this, where we have this structure of a human act. Anything that you do, right, doesn't have to be an act that has moral ramifications or not. But if we think of this as being more or less kind of the basic structure, where there's an intention or will behind an act, and then there's the act itself, and then there's the results that flow from the act. If we're concentrating on this and saying, well, was it a good act? Was it a bad act? For Kant, everything depends upon the will or intention that prompts the act, that causes us to do the act, our reason for doing it. So for Kant, the only way an act can be thought of as having moral worth, in the sense of being morally good, praiseworthy, something which is commendable, is if it's done out of a goodwill. So the goodwill is incredibly important. One of the things he says about it is that it's the only thing in the world that is good in itself, which is maybe not quite so accurate if we look forward to things that he says, for instance, about the person. But in context, the goodwill can't be made bad by any results that come from it. It's good in itself. There's nothing that could happen as a result of a goodwill which would negate the goodness of that will, I think, is the point that he's trying to get across. So the goodwill is really important in Kant's moral philosophy, I would say, because it's only acts that are done from a goodwill that can be called good acts, morally good acts. Number two, explain the importance of the concept of duty in Kant's moral philosophy. Well, if we follow the logic of how this thing unfolds, and Kant says that a good act is one that's done out of a goodwill, well, we can ask, what is a goodwill? And it turns out that Kant believes that we all believe, that a goodwill is a will that is prompted by duty. That is, I have a goodwill if the reason for my action is my recognition that I have a duty to act in a certain way. Duty is an incredibly important concept for Kant. So for Kant, the big contrast, the typical contrast, is between what he calls inclination and duty. If I do something from inclination, I do it because I want to do it. I do it because I have a feeling for doing it. I do it because I have a desire to do it. Now, those things I do all the time out of want, feeling, and desire, and it doesn't make them bad. But what it means is that whatever I do with that intention behind it, or that's what prompts the action, that they have no moral value. It doesn't mean they're bad. But if I do something out of a want, out of feeling, desire, it's just not a moral act. Now, it may be bad, it may not be bad, but the point is that unless it's done out of a recognition of duty, it has no real moral worth. Again, it doesn't mean it's bad. It means it's not morally commendable. So that's the big, I would say, contrast is between things we do out of inclination and things we do out of a recognition of duty. Number 3, explain the importance of the moral law in Kant's moral philosophy. Well, maybe that's a big issue, but again, the unfolding sort of logic of the thing, where one question leads to another, we ask ourselves, what is a goodwill? A goodwill is something. A goodwill is a will that is determined by duty, our own recognition that we have a duty. But then we can ask, and do need to ask, duty to what? There's no such thing as a free-floating duty. There has to be something which imposes the duty upon me. And for Kant, that is the moral law. That is, it is one of the big issues, one of the big themes that I've been hitting is that we're just free individual creatures, and we make our own choices, and we feel that we're autonomous. We rule ourselves. However, Kant believes that sometimes we come into some sort of, let's say, metaphorically, contact with something bigger than ourselves, and that's something that has authority over us, something which can oblige us, something which can impose a duty upon us. And that's the moral law. That is, I realize that, yes, I am autonomous in general, that I make my own decisions, and my freedom of action is more or less unlimited. But that when I encounter the moral law, I recognize that it has authority over me. So it has, as he says, it's an object of respect. That is, that I realize that I must follow it. And that must expresses, again, this concept of duty, that it's only the moral law that has the authority over me or over any human individual to oblige them to do or not do something. Number 4, difficult question. Explain the connection of the first categorical imperative to the preceding questions. Well, if we think about what the first categorical imperative says, that whatever I do, my maxim of action must be capable of serving as a universal law. That is a law for everyone. The first categorical imperative really is about lawfulness. It's about that authority over me that the moral law has. That is, I recognize that whatever I do, it must be lawful. Is what that I think that imperative really says. It's not a particular law like don't kill or don't steal. It's a law about lawfulness. That is, we recognize that whatever we do and whatever the moral reality of our actions is, it must be lawful. And if it's not lawful, if I'm not following a maxim that I would be willing for everyone else to follow, or that I would want everyone else to follow in the same situation, that I know that it's not ethical. My actions must be lawful. That's just sort of built in to my moral sense. Finally, number 5, explain what the first categorical imperative actually requires you to do. Well, that's an interesting question. It's probably a good question. Let's think of what it. So, what does it actually ask me to do? If that's a version of it, I think it's a fair version of the first version of the categorical imperative. It asked me, first of all, number 1, to figure out what my rule of action is, which, as we said in class, difficult thing to do, but that's step 1. What rule am I actually following here? It's a very difficult thing to do in some cases, and very fateful, right? But that's the first thing it asks you to do. So let's say, So first thing you need to do is to decide what your rule is. Second thing, I think a second thing you're called upon to do is to ask yourself whether you would really endorse it, whether you would really stand behind it as a rule that everyone should follow. That is not easy either. So I think that the answer to this question is that you need to do these two things. How exactly you do it? Well, I think we've talked in class about some of the difficulties involved. But that's what you're asked to do.